George has asked me to speak this morning about discipleship, especially regarding Muslim women. Most of what I'm going to say actually relates to everybody that you might be discipling. But since I've been asked to specifically target Muslim women, which is what I usually work with in discipleship, I will give you a few special pointers for them. If you want to know more about how I got into this, being a medical doctor, etc., we can talk about that later. Now, American Ethnic Ministries has Palm Project for pursuing and loving Muslims, and Star Project, which is shining to Asian races. So that's more like Hindus and Buddhists and Sikhs. You will be getting a handout, Lord willing. I think Dawn went to get it. So most of what's on the PowerPoints that you will find on the handout, but I will give you the handy dandy explanation. Why I put up Bill Bridges' Preach Christ Challenge Islam is that's our paradigm, that's our working manifesto for American Ethnic Ministries, especially regarding Muslims. In fact, you can take these and put them into any context you like, and it applies especially to evangelism, to what I call pre-discipleship, to discipleship, and to every relationship you have in your life. And I find it's very helpful to have little compartments so that you know what you're doing in your life. In American Ethnic Ministries, we try to break things down into simple steps that are easy to remember and easy to practice. Evangelism, most of you, or at least a lot of you, I recognize from last week, you took the lesson on evangelism. And pre-discipleship is an interesting category because what I've found is a lot of what you might be doing with your long-term Muslim friends actually comes into the discipleship category. So a lot of what we'll talk about today as discipleship is pre-discipleship. In other words, if you're walking with a Muslim over years, you might find that they start to doubt Islam. In fact, they may even have left Islam. And you are teaching them basic principles about Christianity, about how Christians live, about the difference, and yet they aren't actually believers yet. And so whether or not you're discipling someone who's a believer or someone who's very attracted to you because you are a believer and wants to learn more, you will be teaching them some of the same things. You will be building bridges, preaching Christ, and challenging falsehood. So this bottom one about all relationships refers to the fact that if whoever you are friends with, you may not be challenging Islam, but maybe you're challenging Hinduism, or maybe you're out on Pearl Street like some of us were last week, challenging New Age religion, a lot of other false beliefs. But what we say is anytime you're with people, in any relationship, you can either be building bridges with them, showing love, people call it putting deposits in the love bank. You can be preaching Christ, and you can be challenging whatever falsehood they are believing. And that's different depending on the setting you're in. If you're in a debate, you're probably going to be challenging falsehoods. Maybe you talk to the person next to you and say, well, what do you think about that? You know, do you believe in abrogation or not? But you're not going to say that to someone you're just meeting. And if you have a friend that you're in a long-term relationship with, the kind of bridges that you would build would be different than if you're on an open outreach distribution and you just want to have a smile and get them something fast. So for these three categories, today we're going to focus on a type of preaching Christ. There will be a little bit about building bridges. In our training, we do separate lessons on that, and we also teach about challenging Islam. I'm only going to say a few things about that today, and we're going to focus mostly on the part about sharing Christ or the Christian life, category 2. So first, let's talk about some general concepts of discipling Muslims that have come to Christ. I believe since my talk is a summary of this, you may be getting some reinforcement, not to say repetition, of concepts you have already received. And rather than apologizing, I will say, oh, great, if you heard this before, it's like I thought in medical school. You know what? We need repetition because there's so much to learn. If a different professor says the same thing, great. Now, that helps me get it. So things that you may have heard, I hope this will reinforce. And I also hope that I will be presenting a lot of concepts that are new or just a little on a different edge. So your goals for discipleship will be, some of them will be the same as you have for anyone that you are discipling. How many of you here have discipled a Muslim background believer? You want to raise your hands? Great, okay. About a third to half the people. How many of you have discipled anyone? And I'm going to ask of a couple of categories. One is when you are in a very close discipling relationship, almost one-on-one, and you're working with the person over a year or so. How many have done that kind of a discipleship? Okay, great, most of you. And then how many of you have done something that we might call Christian education or Christian endeavor? You've taught Sunday school. You've basically been involved in nurturing the church and helping people grow. I think that's pretty much everybody. So we've all been involved in different aspects of it, and therefore you have a sense of what you need to do. So to really have a discipleship, we want someone to have a degree of accountability if we're going to have a little more formal experience. And when you are starting on this with a Muslim, I think it really is good, a former Muslim, to be sure that they are in some kind of situation where they will be getting training they need. And I'm not going to go into a lot of the issues between, talking to somebody of the same or different sex. But I would say in the case of a close discipleship relationship, you want it to be somebody of the same sex. I mean, maybe you're saying, well, it's my brother or whatever. But sooner or later, you'll want to bring in someone who is of the same sex as that person so they can relate. And also, in spending a lot of time together, it won't either be threatening or viewed improperly. So other general ideas for MBB discipleship. In fact, I think I just heard some commentary on this, that Muslims are programmed differently than a Christian or a nominal Christian or a Westerner. I mean, really differently. And when I say programmed, I mean things in the brain connect differently. In medicine, we learn about how the, circuits go across the corpus callosum in the brain, how different things in the brain get wired. And a lot of our thought patterns get programmed very young. So I'm asking you to recognize that. If you were raised from a Christian background or a secular background, your brain is probably going to process things differently. For one thing, in the West, we are educated in what's called critical thinking. Most Muslims are educated in memorization and to accept what the Quran says. It's a different type of education. After years of your brain being trained a certain way, it's kind of hard to untrain it. So this is not good or bad. As I say here, we are all impacted by our culture. American culture is not totally sanctified, as some of you might have guessed. There are concepts and habits that are ingrained in Muslims that are very difficult to overcome. Now, you might say this is a broad general categorization, and I will say you're right. But in general, even a nominal secular Muslim is going to have a very different way of thinking than a Christian or a nominal Christian. Something that we find especially in former Muslims is that they tend to have a very tough and independent character. Like any particular characteristic, this has good and bad. Notice that if someone is strong enough to leave their culture, their family, to critically think about concepts foreign to them, then they probably are tough. And so it's a good thing because it helped them convert. This is especially true with Muslim women. I don't think I've known any that aren't of strong character because of the way they are raised to be very in some ways extra submissive, makes it hard for them. So it's good in that they're open to salvation, but a lot of times it can be more challenging for rebuke and correction of the type you need to do in discipleship. Let's face it, nobody likes to be corrected or rebuked, and it's sometimes even harder when you come from a shame and honor culture, and when your personality is strong. The only thing is, remember, and hopefully you learned this from other courses here, that things people may argue with or not like to hear at the beginning, they will become more open to later on as they consider it. And indeed, many Muslims have become Christians after considering concepts that they argued with when they first heard it. So, your discipleship approach also should reflect the individual that you're working with, their personality, their education, social status, age, and experience. Each one of these could have a seminar on it. I tend to feel more comfortable working with educated people, say students, other doctors, people that speak enough English that we're not dependent on my Arabic. It's harder for me with, say, immigrant women who are very uneducated, don't speak the language, have no concept of reason. So depending on who you are, you might have a different category that you're comfortable with. Some people are more comfortable with less educated people, etc. So you remember, you may not always get what you're comfortable with because God likes to challenge us and there are needs everywhere that we need to meet. But these are differences that you will find your approach being very different with them. Other issues that are general for men and women and pretty much all Muslims, cultural and language issues. If there are Muslims born in America, you'll still have some cultural issues, but usually there are a degree of language issues. People don't always understand what you say. You may have to repeat it, or don't assume that they understand you. Phrase things differently, and say it a couple of times. Many times I think I've been exceedingly clear and said something in multiple sessions with that person, and then we go with somebody else and the other person says it and they say, "Oh, that's really good. I haven't heard that before." And you're thinking, I've told you many times. So things don't always get through. Another issue that you will face is, what was their concept of Christians before they became a believer? This will impact a lot of them, especially people who are thinking Christians are very secular and have a liberal lifestyle. That actually does attract some Muslims to become a Christian. And maybe you've already had discussion on what you do in that situation. Assume this I have heard and experienced. If you are discipling a Muslim woman or pre-discipling one, you need to assume that she has been abused. And I would say this is something kind of special looking at women. However, a lot of men have been abused too. In a shame and honor culture, there's a lot of degradation to everybody, because there's this idea that you must conform or you must show your worthiness. With women, the kinds of abuse, it's amazing how frequent physical and sexual abuse are. I mean, very, very common. It's more common could we save questions till the break since we're on camera and all? So, yes, even in America, it's more common than one might think. But I think it helps if, again, we want to do what my grandmother, who learned a lot of her sayings in the Victorian era, said, which is consider the source. And that means anytime somebody does something or says something, think of where it's coming from. So when you're looking at a Muslim, or say in this example, a Muslim woman, maybe she's strong-headed, but you also need to remember that she probably has been abused in some way. She may be a second wife and not even telling you. Her dad may have really beaten her I know someone who was basically sort of beaten unconscious by her family just for, talking to someone of the opposite sex or whatever. There are some tenuous things. So there's usually almost some psychological component. And I think in your discipleship process, you should incorporate some elements of what are called nowadays recovery. And it says each Muslim woman is unique because I was asked to speak mainly about Muslim women. But each Muslim and each person is unique. Here you see a variety of people from some women. I shot that in Turkey. Then there's a militant Iranian on top. The woman on the bottom was from a very politically active Moroccan family. And the one on the left is from the Middle East who is now a believer. So remember Jesus' approach, and I think a lot of us tend to overlook this because people say, oh, never argue with anyone, always just show love or whatever. But we should look at Jesus as our example and our master, right? And Jesus, remember, was different depending on the person or the place that their brain was at the time he met them. So with his sincere seekers and disciples, he let them in on certain information that he didn't share with everybody else. Think about it, and you can meditate over this on your own. There were needy people, and that was like the woman at the well. Just going through these first two examples, people who are sincere and really want to know, I love it, that's my favorite, right? They come to you and they say, so what do Christians believe? Or if they just became a Christian, they say, so what do I do next? How do I learn more? And don't we all love that? Sometimes we meet a needy, really needy person. And I will say one person I ended up discipling was so needy and abused, I didn't even mention the gospel right away. Just as we're together, I just say little things from the Bible, or, well, the Bible says this, or Jesus said that, and then got to the gospel. But this person was so abused they couldn't even really focus. And so you need to be aware of where they are at the time. And then actually that particular very needy person did become a believer. There are proud people. I've been at an Islamic institute where I had about a dozen students and teachers of Islam with me at the same time. I have gone to a lot of interesting places alone and at night. And I had about a dozen afterwards challenging me. They loved having a Christian there to practice on or attack. So one of them, for example, was yelling, the love of Jesus, the love of Jesus. That's all I used to hear, and I became a Muslim. Okay, well, do you think I talked to that guy about the love of Jesus? No. I answered his questions direct on, just like Jesus did the same thing. So if you have a person who doesn't really respond to love at that time, then you're going to use a different approach. And also in personal crowds, if you're speaking to a group of Muslims, you might speak differently, like Jesus did. Now, with any disciple, whether they're Muslim background or not, you're going to face some challenges, and that's what we'll talk about here. There are always competing interests, and as soon as somebody stakes their desire to follow Jesus, other things come in. So you're going to have schedule challenges, like your schedule and their schedule, whether they go to work or they're at school, and their friends, their family, social obligations, and fun. People want and need to have some fun, so you will see that happening. Then stumbling blocks will come up. Sex, I say, expect an agent of distraction. That doesn't always mean porno type sex, but like someone of the opposite sex, boom, right away, maybe within a week of the time someone becomes a believer, a romantic interest will show up, or their boyfriend or girlfriend or husband, wife, whatever, will maybe cause trouble. And then there can be trouble with interpersonal relationships, especially when you've got cultural issues, if you are discipling someone from another culture. So these things are going to happen. With a Muslim background person, a special trial that you will face will be recidivism, which means going back to what they used to believe. I have heard about 80%. I haven't personally experienced that, but this is a statistic that is out there, and that's kind of scary. It might depend on what people are considering to be a conversion also. If you just think if someone says, "What, I love Jesus," well, that's not really a conversion. But we know there have been some grand fiascos. For example, one who became an officer in a church eventually and then ran off with the church money. That was a large church that I know of. So that, there are some problems. Why do people go back? And I think that can be a lot from fear. Of course, you probably are not surprised. They will usually tell me afterwards they're having dreams or they're getting phone calls from relatives saying they need to die. It's not fun. And if they're not totally convinced, it's hard for them to stay with the pressure. Another thing is worldliness, because I am mostly involved, pretty much all, in discipling Muslims in America. So there is this wow, now I have freedom and I love it in America. Also disappointment. Especially think of people that have come to the Lord through miracles or dreams, and they're getting all their prayers answered. And those of us who have been believers for a while know that that doesn't go on always. You get to times where it seems like your prayers aren't being answered. And it's a little discouraging, but that's part of the growing process. If they aren't adequately discipled to expect this, or if they go to a church that's always having some kind of miracle, they will wonder what's wrong with me, or why am I not getting miracles, and then they doubt whatever miracle they had. There's a 5-year benchmark that some people use. I don't know if they use that in Horizons, but usually the thought is if they make it 5 years, they probably are, going to be a sincere believer. And the longer they believe, the better, and the more chance they will stay that way. I think if you are discipling someone, you should do a risk analysis for what their recidivism would be, their tendency to go back, and think about what brought them to Christ in the first place. What was it that attracted them? And if that can be sustained, whether it was a dream or vision or miracle. Was it worldliness? Is that something that they would be inclined to go back to? And then I really think when it's appropriate, you should talk about it. What you see their risk being. If they have a lot of family pressure, you can talk to them about that. If they're inclined to be worldly, you can talk to them about that. Now, when you are discipling a Muslim background believer in America, you will doubtless run into what I call the child star syndrome, because it's very common that Christians are so excited to see a Muslim come to Christ. And of course, like most new believers, usually the new Muslim believer is excited about it. And so it starts out, we encourage them to share their testimony, and it goes on and on. You really can't avoid it, because even if you try to avoid it, it happens, and you don't want to put someone in a closet unless their life is at risk. So I think that it needs to be addressed, because what can happen is what I call comparison shopping, and this, if not always, very frequently happens, which is where, because of this child star syndrome, the former Muslim can go from church to church or organization to organization or Christian to Christian. And when it gets to the point that there is accountability coming down on them, or rules or criticism, which none of which is easy to take, but which is part of discipleship, if they go somewhere else, then they might get a different offer. For example, if they give a testimony in one church, once I did a team testimony in a group with a former Muslim, a Saudi Muslim, and was told that's the most powerful testimony I've ever heard. So when there's that kind of attraction, those people are going to be asked to go to other churches. Well, they will meet other Christians who kind of adore them and offer things. So it really, you will find some competition in that, and that is a challenge you will face. In fact, one of them went back to Islam because they started comparing benefits, like what will the Christians give me? Well, the mosque is now offering me this. And that's even of somebody who was baptized. There's a lot of social pressure, especially in Islam, because of Eastern culture in general, what's expected, what your family expects. You may not have this with a lot of educated people, but there's a saying in Islam, I mean in Arabic, maybe someone here can quote for me, which says the people who read don't read. It's, and that's ikra la tikra or something. How does that go? Yeah. So a lot of the people of Islam were complimented in the early years because they finally had a religious book in their language. That was a big thing when they got the Quran and a lot of the instigation behind it. And so they were called the people who read, whereas Christians are the people of the book. So what we find is that, especially in Arabic cultures and some other Muslim cultures, there's a lot of not reading and in some profound illiteracy. And I find that a problem in discipleship because in America we automatically tell people, start reading the Bible, read this book. Those of you that have discipled, have you discipled or taught in a church adults or teenagers? Okay. Do you always have some reading material for them? Yeah, we usually do. So think if what happens is like, okay, one Pakistani background woman that came to the Lord, if they don't read in your language or another language, whoa, after they've seen the Jesus film and you don't speak their language well, you see the problems that you have with people who don't read. So that's going to be a challenge. The sense of time is interesting because this impacts so many things. Remember, in Eastern cultures, a lot of times there's a relaxed sense of time. And some of this goes back to the Bedouin days. And even in Arabic, I read one expert analysis which was saying they don't have as many tenses, especially past tenses, as we do in English, because when you were living in a tent in the desert, it didn't matter that much. So you'll find in your relationships, time will be a challenge. A sense of truth, whoa, and honesty, because of some of the things you heard about not wanting to say certain things, of not believing certain things. Even there can be a tendency to say something and believe it's true once you've said it. So as if saying things will make them true. So what we should do as disciplers is help them come to a biblical concept of honesty and truth. And you will even find people might tell you stories that aren't accurate, or they're changing from one place to another. And also with paperwork, you need to help them be honest. Some people tell tremendous lies trying to get into America, and they may ask you for help with that. And then you are like, whoa, what am I going to do? Because you want to keep honest. And I will talk a little bit more about something related to that in our cultural snafus. But another weakness is that to believe if something is said is the same as it's done. Just sort of like God said and it happened. There are reasons for this also that have been presented in culture analysis that we don't have time to go through. But it's good to know that, because in our culture, saying it isn't the same as it being done. And then also you may find that your new disciple has some unrealistic expectations. For example, of what they think life in America is like, of what they think Christians can afford to do for them, of what Christians do for anybody, of what you personally can do for them, and even somewhat of an entitlement risk. You will need to, or confront, survival skills of the past life. It's not easy making it in many Muslim countries. What did that person do to survive? How did they live? If it was a woman, did she live by using her sensual wiles? And I have seen that happen, very hard to break. If it was a man, you know, were there honesty issues? How did he make a living? Lots of things like that. So think about the past life. I also have found in discipling, and this is probably not going to relate to men at all, but there is an inherent value of men over women, to the effect of, if I'm wanting to meet with someone to disciple them, if there's a man who has an alternate option for them, they will likely value that more. It took me a while to figure that out. I don't like it, but you know, coming from that culture, that can happen to women who are discipling other women. Something that actually George assisted me on in my television series that hasn't been broadcast yet, but you are one of the first to know it will be happening. And that is, we talked about the rules, because the challenge is when you come from a culture where everything is rules and points, and you get so many points for the day of judgment, and then you come to Christianity, there can be a couple of responses to that. And one of them is, hey, we have freedom in Christ, we can do anything. The other is, what are the rules of Christianity? Let me follow those to please God. In America, I personally come more into the or have been exposed more to the freedom. Because think about it, especially regarding women, if the way you were raised, you had to wear long dresses, have this much of your hand covered with long sleeves, and have your total head covered, possibly even your face, then when you take that off, you start getting confused, well, how much do I take off? You know, where I don't have to wear a skirt to the floor, where does it stop? So it really is a challenge, really a big challenge, I would say, with most Muslim women I've discipled, to help them through that. Because what is it? We don't want to exchange one set of rules for another. We don't want them to think that Christianity is about rules. But those of us who are American know that if you dress a certain way, people are going to get an idea about you, which usually is not what Christian disciplers or teachers would suggest. So, yeah, I have been accused of encouraging a former Muslim to dress like an old woman. One of them told my daughter, your mother tries to get me to dress like an old woman. Someone also said, what are you, you know, I may as well be a Muslim if I have to dress this way. Someone also said, a different person, Christians shouldn't judge me by what I wear. And if a Christian says anything like, whoa, why are you wearing that micro mini skirt or spaghetti straps? They're like, this church is so judgmental, I'll go to another one. So, you know, it's a challenge. Relations with the opposite sex, when you come from a totally sequestered background and then you're not sequestered anymore, does anything go? You know, can you be alone with the man in your room at night and we're not doing anything? You know, this is just something you will face. The other thing is alcohol. Muslims don't drink alcohol. Well, you know, different branches of Christianity have different views on this. And again, when you've left the rules, we have seen people start drinking alcohol, and maybe even inappropriately by most Christian standards. So how do we deal with that? And the disciplines. So those are things that they're doing that maybe we would like them not to do, but what about the disciplines? What about prayer and reading the Bible? How do we explain to them that these are not regulated but desirable? And in our show where I interview George Husney, we come up with some guidelines of trying to please the Lord, and I think guidelines that you yourself know already, but just realize you will need to get around to that. In a different episode, I interview George on the occult, because this is not something that you will necessarily come up against right away, but pretty much every Muslim culture has a lot of folk Islam in it. And I have been to an Islamic institute where they definitely say no form of occult is acceptable, pretty much the same as Christianity. No amulets, fortune telling, anything like that. And yet in Islamic culture, we know it's very popular to use curses and charms, do astrology, supernatural phenomenon, read coffee grounds. And these things they're doing automatically without even thinking that it might not be acceptable. Someone offered to give my son a love potion. And I think some people have told me I've had horrible curses put on me. People have taken my hair because I was beautiful. There was a lot of jealousy and women cursed me. Interesting stuff. But I think the Quran as a spell is one of the most interesting. You will see sometimes Islamic institutes will say you should not even wear a verse of the Quran in a little box if you're wearing it as an amulet, yet you will commonly see Quranic verses in places. You'll see them around the ceiling in rooms. I think it could be looked at either way, because you're not to see it as an amulet, yet really when you read the Quran, if you read it in excellent Arabic, each letter gives you something like 40 good points for the next life. So whether having that up there, just it being you're in the room with all the Islamic verses, or whether it's that you might read it and it will give you good luck, you see that's kind of a fine line. One former Muslim told me the Quran is a spell. They whispered it over me when I was born. I had to hear that broadcast from the minaret 5 times a day. My whole life and the entire life of everyone in Islam, they are under this spell of the Quran and the words of the Quran. So those are some of the many forms that you will need to deal with it. Visa status is an interesting thing because you want to be sure someone isn't faking being a believer just to get a green card. And then there's a lot of talk about when people become refugees and the sincerity of that. But the other thing is they're not sure where they will be. I know people at different points in that transition. I know one right now who's a secret believer, has not told the family or most others, and is trying to find a way to be here, but we're not sure where they will be. So this whole uncertainty in life is something that they may be going through. And once even trying to think of different ways to help someone in the country, that actually can be a source of conflict when you're trying to help someone. Sometimes people become believers in America, but say students that are paid to go here by a company from the Middle East. I know of a couple of countries that actually pay students to come here, and they're obligated to go back. So one who was attending church a lot, and I think was very close to it, I think because that person had to go back to Saudi, was reluctant to make a commitment. I know of someone going to another Gulf country that I think the same thing, who has actually said they don't believe Islam anymore and they believe the Christian doctrines, but have not committed. And I think it might be because they know they have to go back. And that is like a black cloud hanging. Work ethic is something we could talk about a lot, but basically, most people from America have a certain idea of how you work, what's expected of you, getting up in the morning, reporting to a boss, many things like that. But some of the people you might be discipling could be coming from what our privileged background overseas. Maybe they have servants. In America, we don't have servants much. At most, some people may have someone come in and clean house once a week or so. But in many of the countries we get people from, they're used to servants. And to go from that, when they come to America, especially if they're not trained, they're not qualified to do much. I do know one who was at a very, very high level overseas, who actually had to do housework in America and worked hard. But I also no more which just seem to be having trouble with the idea that you work, you get up whether you like it or not. Work isn't always fun. So, and everybody in America struggles to succeed. I hear, So, yeah, it's, it's not like it's easy for all of you. I was talking to one of them recently and counseling on this and saying, work is hard. It's work. And I've worked many times until the point where I was almost dead because I'm a medical doctor, I have a family, and then adding on ministry. And the person was totally clueless and said, well, I thought you enjoyed your work. So I realized, I'm always putting on the positive Christian attitude, and that can be misunderstood as you're doing everything you do because it's fun or a good time. So when someone comes to the Lord from a Muslim background, there's this onus almost on the person who's discipling them or leading them to Christ, because it's almost like their whole life has gone from planet green to planet red, or vice versa, and you have to assist them how they're going to survive there. If someone comes here from a totally different culture in the Middle East, they've lost all their connections, their support, their family, whoa. You can see that is a big responsibility. Another challenge I faced is the concept between a nominal Christian and a true Christian. You will probably also face this during your evangelism process and pre-discipleship, but even after, the idea that, Americans do this almost comes into, this is what Christians do. So you'll have to look at that. Now, guys, we talked about a lot of trials, the trials of discipling Muslim background believers. Now we're going to talk about some of the smiles, and then we'll do some do's and don'ts, okay? So smiles, these are the good things, and I admit that I don't have as many long discussions about all of these, because hopefully they will be sort of self-implicit and you can figure it out. First is salvation. The angels rejoice, and we do too when someone comes to the Lord. It's amazing. And many times you'll need to remind yourself of this when you're going through a lot of those trials of discipling. Fruit, wow. We're near the Rocky Mountain National Park. And the last time I went through there was several years ago, before I'd seen quite a few Muslims coming to Christ. And I thought, you know what I'm doing? My work. It's like this. It was cold up there, and they have what's called the tundra. Have any of you been up there to the Alpine region or anywhere in the world above the tree line? Not many? Oh, you have to go. It gets to the place where it's so cold that trees can't grow. And it can be rocky soil, and it's got grass. And it's frosty a lot of the year. And I was thinking, I even wrote poems about out of my frustration and near agony. I can't even get the seed in. I'm working the frozen tundra with like a hoe or a pick, trying to get this frozen tundra to produce. And then this time I went earlier this week, it was so encouraging. I noticed at this time of year, the tundra is filled with beautiful wildflowers. They're teeny little things. But they came out of the frozen tundra, which is almost impossible to get things to grow in. So when you see fruit from your work in Islam, remember, it's not easy. You're on the front lines with tough work. A smile is when you see people that weren't interested before or used to ignore everything you say, and now they're interested and they're open. Wow. Muslims are more socially tuned than other people, so you will have perhaps more chances to interact with them and see this, and actually to get together for discipleship and to bring new people to you to share with. Hospitality and generosity. You will be surprised, or maybe if you're already working with Muslims, you know how hospitable and generous the culture is. This is something that goes both ways, and you start sharing it in a Christian context. Also, sharing scripture. Can you imagine when former Muslims start sending you text messages with scriptures in it, and emails, and all those encouraging little things, and then you send it back to them? Watching baby grow, it's like an experience watching any baby grow. It's kind of bittersweet. And when you hear what somebody told you repeated, oh my, isn't that encouraging? You thought it was sunk and dead in the pit, but when it comes up, you love that. Ministry together, yeah. Some people that I've discipled, several of them, we go on outreach together now. Or we share testimonies together. What a blessing. Or we go somewhere and learn mutually. Wow. It's amazing. And then a lot of fun and humor, which you share with other people. So these are smiles. These are really good things. And well, before we go on to the do's and don'ts, I want to mention one thing about building bridges because it's important. And how many of you are currently working with unbelieving Muslims? Okay, I don't want to let this particular bridge pass. Hopefully you did already hear about it, but you may remember that last week Ramadan ended, and within about the week after, they have all kinds of visits and parties. So, for example, just in the last few days, I've been talking to my Muslim contacts around the world. What did you do for Eid? So if you haven't done that and you're keeping in contact with Muslims, part of what we teach in Bridges is keep those contacts going, even if you haven't connected with them for a month, keep it going. So I would suggest you would ask them, what did you do for Eid? For example, in the last day or so, I've gotten a message from Indonesia. We did a lot of memorial service for people, and I thought, oh, that's kind of sad. From Qatar, I got that they had special foods and new clothes, which is pretty typical. And then from a friend in Saudi that we rented a swimming pool and had swimming. And then that led to a little discussion about, well, how do you do that with men and women and what that was about. So this is like an easy, no-brainer bridge that you should do with all of your Muslim contacts right now. So for do's and don'ts, we have about 10 minutes. So I want to explain a lot about everything. You need to decide in advance what is the degree of involvement you are going to have in the discipleship. Is it going to be you or someone else who's the primary discipler? Maybe personality-wise, you're not the best discipler of someone you brought to Christ. And if it's not you, you should probably still keep in touch with them so you're part of the support in their life. And then if it is you, decide how often you're going to meet, etc. For finances, as I said, you tend to get a lot of need in these new believers. And there are different categories, like their living expenses, if they've become refugees. Training, they want to learn more about the Lord. Maybe they want to come to Horizons for a year and they need support for that. Or maybe they want to actually start in ministry. That's a challenge because with all new believers, we're a little careful about, putting them in ministry. So you might need to think about how you would financially help. And then here you see things like a car, apartment, support, weddings. Are you going to help if they get married, if they travel, if they need ride places, shoes, legal help, medicines, etc. So, do always encourage growth. Teaching, if you're together and it's not formal, try to use small words and show them Bible passages, even if it's not organized. Try to get alone so that you can really talk to them heart to heart. And bring other Christians alongside so it's not just you, and they know that this is a support and the way many Christians feel about a subject. And providing a sense of family is really important because remember, they may have lost their family. Try to learn about the culture of whichever country your person came from and develop common interests as you can, what you like to do and what they like to do. I find with some of the Muslim women from the Gulf, they love shopping. They love all of that. They like it if I dress up and wear lots of jewelry. Whereas if you're dealing with a different people group, it's different. So all things to all people. And look for bridges in everyday life, little things that you can connect with in any way that you can think of. If you're not good at finding bridges, ask the Lord to show you some. Really know your limitations. if you can in advance, your time and money, how much you can put into it. And then know what you know and what you don't know. Maybe you know a lot about the Bible, but not much about Islam. So you might need to refer to someone. Or maybe you think you're in a cultural problem. Be ready to ask someone who's a Christian from that culture what to do. When you give advice, and believe me, you will be giving lots of advice in a pre-discipleship or discipleship relationship, keep in mind they may not even really want your advice, although they ask for it and they might reject it. But you'll be asked for things like marriage, sex, family, rape, behavior, visas, career. And when I say marriage, we won't have time to talk about it, but I have about 4 people right now. I don't really know if they're married or not because of this crazy system of multiple certificates and marriages here and there and second marriages and on and on. And I know the details, but according to our way of thinking, is it really married? If, for example, a woman who is a second wife overseas comes here, we don't recognize second marriage yet, although the Supreme Court, who knows what they'll do any day. But do we say, okay, they're not married because we don't recognize it, and they can start dating and marrying another guy here, or vice versa? It's weird. Do expect unpleasantness and problems. For me, things that are unpleasant, and this would be in any area in Muslim ministry or all ministry, is people not taking your advice, even when they're doing something dangerous and you tell them, don't do that. Maybe there's a lack of interest. There's a setback in growth. These are discouraging. Passive-aggressive behavior, which is very frustrating. Snubs and put-downs. And all these things, you look at them now, I'm sure, and you think, what? Well, what's the big deal about that? That's part of life. But you know what? When you're actually going through it, it's not fun or easy. So just remind yourself that Mama Cynthia told me there'd be days like this. And yeah, that's part of it, and it's suffering for the cross. I'm going to give you 3 cultural snafus that have to do with favors that I have found. These are in theory and in experience. One is that the person who's doing a favor for someone else must be made to feel as if they're being given a favor by being allowed to do the favor. In other words, if you are picking someone up because they don't have a ride, or you're buying them groceries, you have to be made to feel as if what you've done is not really worthy of their accepting it. It's kind of, have any of you experienced this yet? Nobody has ever experienced what I'm talking about. Then either you haven't been involved with them much, or I'm not explaining it right. Have you ever had anybody ungrateful for something you've done for them? Okay. Yeah, most of us have had people be ungrateful. So this is a type of ungratefulness that I've had even from Christians of Middle Eastern culture, that if you do something nice for them, it's such a shame if they agree that you did me a favor, that they have to see it in a way and present it to you in a way that they're doing you a favor by letting you do it for them. So it's like, well, you did this for me. Well, really, so-and-so wanted to do this, and it was going to be better or whatever. Just take my word for it. It may sound confusing to you now, but when you come against this snafu and say, oh yeah, Mama Cynthia told me, there'd be days like that. Cultural snafu number 2. Because of the system in a lot of the East, for example, one Middle Eastern person said, oh, a diploma, we can get you a diploma for somebody, no problem. The fact that there is so much bribery and nepotism and favoritism not only tends to devalue certain things like diplomas, but it can also lead to this idea that if you love someone, you'll break the rules for them. And the final one is beware of becoming a patron. I see I have only about 1 minute left, so we're going to leave with the do's, which are stay strong in the Lord, and what I call anchor your side of the bridge, which is for you to be grounded in the fruit of the Spirit, be faithful, caring, and patient. And then you can anchor their side of the bridge by correcting any misunderstandings they had or hurt. And then through that bridge, you can make a bridge to that person and from them to the Lord and help that to be a very strong bridge. For the rest of the talk, which was going to be on the don'ts and a couple of other things, you will see some of the titles there in your handout. If you would like, you can ask me about it later. And I believe now, since my time is officially up, I will turn it back over to the next person, unless they are not here, in which case I will keep talking the rest of the day.
We're here.
Is it break time?
Yeah.
Okay, it's break time. I will be here if you have any questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Cynthia.